doing? Today we are going to be discussing the life of an important figure in the history of Shakespeare, one who you may or may not have heard of. He was a man whose passion for acting took him across the world, and despite all the obstacles that stood in his way, he was able to have a lasting impact and legacy. This is the story of Ira Aldridge. Aldridge was born in New York in 1807, and he attended the African Free School, which was founded as a school for the children of slaves and those that had been freed from slavery. He received a classical education and was able to experience performances of Shakespeare at both the Park Theatre and the African Grove Theatre. Aldridge began acting at the age of 13, and just a few years later, in 1821, he would begin his work with the African Grove Theatre. The company were the subject of racial attacks and protests. It seemed America was far from ready to accept freed African Americans on their streets, let alone on their stages. It was this extreme hostility towards African American actors which prompted Aldridge to move to the UK in 1824, where the abolition of slavery bill was being passed. By 1825, aged just 18, Aldridge had secured the lead role of Orinoco in the production of The Revolt of Suriname at the Royal Coburg Theatre in London, which is now the Old Vic. And it has long been a prestigious stage for any actor of merit. Throughout his life, Aldridge performed some of the most prestigious and sought-after roles even to this day, including the likes of Othello, Richard III, Macbeth, and King Lear, and audiences loved him. But he was more than just an actor. He was a human being who would use his platform to open up dialogue on important social issues. On the closing night of his productions, he would directly address the audience on the impact of slavery and the many injustices that were occurring across the world. This, along with other revolutionary speakers at the time, played a significant role in changing the public's perception of the slave trade. Ultimately, it was a combination of his extraordinary acting talent and his intelligence and eloquence that captivated audiences. In 1828, Aldridge became the first black person to manage a British theatre when he took up the role at the Coventry Theatre at only 20 years of age. Tony Howard, the leader of the multicultural Shakespeare project at Warwick University, states that in January 1828, Ira Aldridge was advertised as a fairground attraction, a most extraordinary novelty, a man of colour, yet only a few weeks later, Coventry gave him the keys to its theatre. Howard himself had been campaigning for the greater recognition of the life of Ira Aldridge, stating that the people of Coventry had never really shown an interest in the abolition of slavery, and that Aldridge had changed the climate of thinking. After hearing the man himself speak so honestly about slavery, the people of Coventry were inspired to petition for its abolition. Having been named the UK City of Culture in 2021, artist Dreff was commissioned to depict Aldridge on the side of the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry to commemorate and recognise his great role in the history of the city. This particular piece draws inspiration from the famous painting by Henry Perronet Briggs of Aldridge in his role as Othello, and it feels like a very fitting memorial to a man who meant so much to the people of Coventry during his lifetime. Dreff himself said, "It was an honour to make a piece of work that amplifies this fascinating story. Many of the passers-by I spoke to did not know who he was or his connection to the city, so it was great to be able to bring awareness to his life and achievements." He began touring both the UK and Europe in 1831, and in 1833 he was chosen to play Othello at the Theatre Royal in Covent Garden. This was because the original actor Edmund Kean had collapsed on stage, and the theatre manager Pierre Laporte turned to Aldridge. For those who don't know, Othello is specifically written as a non-white character, but Aldridge playing the role, despite obviously being non-white himself, was met initially with resistance. But at the time, this was one of the few, what you might call, respected theatres in the country, so to have a black actor playing a lead role of anything was a massive deal. And considering we wouldn't see another black actor in the role until almost a century later, it really puts into perspective just how talented Ira Aldridge was. Despite causing outrage among many, he almost became a beacon for everything that could be achieved, regardless of race. He even said himself at one point, he desires only to be judged by his actions and relies on the discrimination and generosity which appreciates endeavour and rewards effort. Despite gaining popularity with audiences, of course his critical reception was for the most part less than desirable. Although there were some positive reviews of his work lauding him for his versatility in performing various characters, they often came hand in hand with backhanded compliments, such as his acting, which in a European would be more than respectable, is in an African truly wonderful. He was also described as being bacon-kneed and narrow-chested, with lips so shaped that it's utterly impossible for him to pronounce English. The Times also claimed that his copper skin wasn't dark enough to play Othello. Now remember, it was the norm at the time for white actors to play this role in blackface up until the 20th century. In 1965, Laurence Olivier won an Academy Award for playing Othello in blackface. So to say that black actors were held to an impossibly high standard is an obvious understatement. There were clearly very strong attitudes that needed to be broken down for Aldridge to truly get the respect that he deserved. Aldridge is also credited for making Shakespeare more accessible to the people of Europe, in particular Poland, who up until then could only hear Shakespeare in either German or Russian. He was also instrumental in taking Shakespeare to a Serbian audience, showing for the first time that typical Shakespearean English could be translated into Serbian. And for this he was honoured with a plaque at the National Theatre in Belgrade, which was built 2 years after his death. So how will he be remembered? Aldridge would ultimately have a lasting impact on the world of acting. His daughter Amanda, born in 1866, became an opera singer and a composer and a teacher, and she would go on to work with actor Paul Robeson to improve the clarity and power of his voice. Robeson would then go on to be the first black actor to play the role of Othello in London since Aldridge, almost coming full circle on his story. In America, Aldridge was seen as an inspiration amongst black actors who were still facing persecution in the professional field, just as they were in their everyday lives. In 1932, his achievements were recognised at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. The original theatre burned down in 1926 and money needed to be raised in order to rebuild it. So to help raise funds, people were able to nominate a figure to be honoured with a bronze plaque, which would be fitted onto the stalls. African American and Afro-Caribbean communities worked with the American Shakespeare Foundation to raise £1,000 for a plaque bearing the name Ira Aldridge. In 2012, writer Lolita Chakrabarti set out to tell the story of Aldridge's life in the play Red Velvet, specifically his time playing the role of Othello. And as I mentioned earlier, Aldridge took up the role in 1833 after the collapse of Edmund Kean. In Red Velvet, we see just how resistant his fellow cast members were to his style of acting, and it just gives us a sense of the constant battle that Aldridge had just to be heard. Actors would argue about his competence and knowledge of theatre, where you just think maybe they wouldn't if it weren't for the colour of his skin. But ultimately, the play seems to portray Aldridge not only as an incredibly talented actor, but also as a very intelligent man. The resistance to him almost feels obvious when you consider how much of a threat he was to the traditional ways of British theatre. So that was just a brief introduction into the life of Ira Aldridge. If you want to learn more, there are plenty of resources out there, and I would always recommend diving as deep as you can, because the more we understand some of these incredible stories, the more we realise our own capabilities. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, there's plenty more videos coming. Also, if you have any suggestions of people you'd like to see me do a video about, just drop them in the comments, and you can also find me on Instagram and on Twitter at JRMediaLDN. And I'll see you on the next one.